Today's top stories are not just about politics, technology, courts, markets, sports, or weather. They're about stress tests. A court system is deciding how far executive power can reach. Regulators are deciding whether the most advanced AI models should be treated like ordinary software or strategic infrastructure. Apple is showing consumers that the AI boom has a physical supply chain, and that someone has to pay for it. Fire risk is forcing governors to limit a holiday tradition. And in Buffalo, the NHL Draft turned into something closer to a trading desk, where teams converted picks into players and players into optionality. The common thread is control. Who has it? Who wants more of it? And what happens when old rules collide with new pressure? This is your top stories wrap-up for June 27, 2026. I'm going to walk through the biggest developments, separate the facts from the interpretation, and then look ahead at what investors, policy watchers, and everyday citizens should be watching next. Let's start in Washington, because the Supreme Court ended the week with decisions that will ripple well beyond the legal briefs. A most immediate ruling, in human terms, concerns temporary protected status. The court allowed the Trump administration to end legal protections for Haitians and Syrians who had been allowed to live and work in the United States because conditions in their home countries were considered unsafe. According to the Associated Press, the decision affects roughly 350,000 Haitians and about 6,000 Syrians, with the change expected to take effect July 27th. APnews.com. The legal issue is technical. Temporary protected status is not permanent residency, and it does not create a direct path to citizenship. But the practical effect is plain. People who have been working legally, paying taxes, raising children, and staffing local businesses may lose work authorization or face deportation. That creates strain for families, employers, schools, churches, and city governments. The interpretation here is that the court has given the executive branch wider room to unwind temporary immigration protections. That does not settle every future immigration dispute, but it does reduce one major source of judicial friction for the administration. The court also moved decisively on guns. In Wolford v. Lopez, a 6-3 decision struck down Hawaii's default rule that treated private property open to the public, places like stores, hotels, shopping centers, and gas stations, as off-limits to licensed gun carriers unless the owner gave express permission. The ruling strengthens the post-Bruin direction of Second Amendment law, where states must justify modern gun regulations against historical tradition. APnews.com. Then came a major win for Monsanto and its parent company Bayer. In Monsanto v. Durnell, the court held that federal pesticide law preempts certain state failure to warn claims over Roundup labeling, when the EPA has not required a cancer warning on the label. The key point is not that the court resolved the scientific debate over glyphosate. It did not. The key point is that it narrowed a legal pathway that plaintiffs had used to bring warning label lawsuits under state law. MayorBrown.com. Taken together, these rulings point in different ideological directions, but share one institutional theme. Federal power is being reinforced. The executive gets more room on immigration. Federal constitutional doctrine limits state gun rules. Federal labeling authority blocks some state law claims. For investors, businesses, and state policymakers, that means the operating environment is becoming more nationalized in some areas and less forgiving of state-by-state experimentation. Now layer that legal backdrop onto immigration enforcement. Human Rights Watch and Physicians for Human Rights reported that at least 52 people died in ICE custody during the first 500 days of President Trump's second term. The groups tied the rise to an expanded detention system, medical delays, oversight failures, and gaps in transparency. That is the fact pattern. The interpretation is that immigration policy is now facing a mortality reckoning at the same time the administration has more room to proceed with enforcement. A larger detention population, weaker legal protections for some migrants, and documented medical failures create not only humanitarian risk, but administrative and political risk. Watch for watchdog reports, congressional hearings, and lawsuits. Those are the mechanisms that could force operational changes, if changes come. Now let's turn to artificial intelligence, where Washington is moving from warnings to gatekeeping. The U.S. Commerce Department approved Anthropic's limited deployment of its Mythos 5 model to vetted customers and partners after earlier restrictions tied to cybersecurity and national security concerns. Separately, OpenAI and Anthropic have limited access to new models while a federal cybersecurity review proceeds. OpenAI said its limits came at the administration's request. Here is the fact. Access to frontier models is being restricted and restored through a government-supervised process. Here is the interpretation. The most advanced AI systems are no longer being treated simply as consumer software. They are beginning to look more like strategic assets, closer to semiconductors, encryption, aerospace, or dual-use technology. That shift has huge implications. Controlled access may reduce misuse, cyber risk, and national security exposure. But it may also concentrate capability among big companies, government-approved customers, and institutions with the legal and compliance resources to pass through the gate. Startups, independent researchers, foreign customers, and smaller enterprises may find the frontier narrowing. And this brings us directly to markets. Apple raised prices on MacBook and iPad models, saying it could no longer absorb steep increases in memory and storage costs linked to AI data center demand. Axios reported price hikes in the range of roughly 15 to 25% across several Mac and iPad devices, with the iPhone spared for now. This is one of the cleanest examples yet of AI moving from the abstract to the checkout page. The AI boom requires data centers. Data centers require chips, memory, storage, power, cooling, land, and grid connections. When hyperscalers compete aggressively for those inputs, prices rise. Eventually, even Apple's supply chain scale cannot fully absorb the shock. For investors, the key question is not simply whether Apple protects margins, it is whether consumers tolerate higher prices in mature hardware categories. Laptops and tablets are not smartphones in 2010. Upgrade cycles can stretch, households can delay, enterprises can sweat assets longer. So the forward-looking issue is demand elasticity. At what price point does AI-driven cost inflation start suppressing unit sales? That is a broader market question too. AI may be deflationary in some services over time, if it boosts productivity. But right now, in physical infrastructure, it is inflationary. It is a giant buyer of scarce resources. Now to sports, where the NHL Draft in Buffalo gave us a very different kind of market signal. The Toronto Maple Leafs selected Gavin McKenna with the #1 pick in the 2026 NHL Draft, with Justin Bieber announcing the pick at KeyBank Center. Buffalo, the host city, used the #4 pick on defenseman Daxon Rudolph. NHL.com. That was the spectacle. The more interesting story was the trading. The Vegas Golden Knights traded Pavel Dorofeyev to the New York Rangers for the #26 pick, the #92 pick, and a conditional 2028 first-rounder. Boston acquired J.J. Peterka from the Utah Mammoth for the #23 pick and a conditional 2028 first-round pick. And Anaheim sent Mason McTavish to St. Louis for the #15 and #29 picks in the first round. Fox5Vegas.com. The interpretation? Teams are treating draft capital like currency in a high-speed market. Some clubs are buying certainty, young NHL players who can help now. Others are selling established talent for multiple bites at the future. Boston's move says, "We are not waiting." St. Louis paying 2 first-rounders for McTavish says the Blues value a young, established forward more than the uncertainty of mid-first-round picks. Anaheim's side says the opposite: collect assets, preserve flexibility, and keep building. Vegas moving Dorofeyev suggests cap management and optionality. The Rangers, meanwhile, are trying to convert picks into immediate offense. Sports fans call these trades. Investors would recognize them as capital allocation. Beyond courts, code, and sports, the day also brought sharp reminders of physical risk. In Beijing, a small aircraft crashed into the CITIC Tower, also known as China Zun, killing the pilot and injuring 13 people, according to Chinese authorities. The building is Beijing's tallest, rising more than 1,700 feet, and the incident immediately raised questions because the capital's airspace is tightly controlled. Appnews.com. The fact is the crash caused limited casualties compared with what could have happened in a dense business district. The unanswered questions are how the aircraft entered that airspace, whether there was a mechanical or communications failure, and whether urban aviation rules need to be reviewed. In Utah, Governor Spencer Cox declared a state of emergency and imposed temporary statewide fireworks restrictions through July 5th, as hot, dry, windy conditions intensified wildfire risk. The Associated Press reported that red flag warnings stretched across parts of the West as crews fought expanding fires. But also an economic story. Wildfire risk affects insurance, housing, utilities, tourism, state budgets, and municipal planning. The annual question is no longer simply whether fire season will be bad. It is whether communities can adapt fast enough as risk becomes more frequent and more expensive. In the Middle East, Israel and Lebanon signed a U.S.-mediated framework agreement, described by Secretary of State Marco Rubio as a first step toward peace. The agreement does not include Hezbollah, and reporting indicates implementation could begin with Israeli withdrawal from 2 areas in southern Lebanon and deployment of the Lebanese military there. APnews.com. That is de-escalatory, but fragile. The forward-looking scenario depends on whether the Lebanese state can assert control, whether Hezbollah accepts or resists the framework, and whether Israel believes threats across the border are truly contained. In maritime security, the International Maritime Organization paused an evacuation effort through the Strait of Hormuz after a vessel was reportedly struck by a projectile off Oman. This matters because Hormuz is one of the world's most important energy choke points. Even temporary disruption can raise shipping risk, insurance costs, and oil market anxiety. IMO.org. Back in the United States, Texas approved a required public school reading list that includes Bible stories for more than 5 million students. Supporters frame the material as part of literature and cultural history. Critics argue it blurs the line between education and religious instruction. The legal fight, if it comes, will likely turn on that distinction. In Washington, the National Park Service said the liner of the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool was cut with a sharp knife or razor, damaging sealant tied to a rehabilitation project. It is a small act in material terms, but symbolically large. Civic spaces depend not just on security budgets, but on public trust and routine stewardship. A few other stories are worth keeping on your radar. At the World Cup, France beat Norway 4-1, behind an Ousmane Dembélé hat-trick. A performance that strengthened France's position and added another dramatic moment to the expanded tournament. Le Monde.fr. In baseball, Milwaukee Brewers right-hander Jacob Misiorowski threw a 105.5-mile-per-hour fastball against the Chicago Cubs, tying one of the fastest pitches tracked in the StatCast era and raising a fascinating player development question. How do teams balance extreme velocity with durability, especially from a starter? MLB.com. In the WNBA, Phoenix Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas was suspended for 1 game after the league reviewed contact with Caitlin Clark that officials missed in real time. The larger issue is not one play. It is how a fast-growing league manages physicality, officiating consistency, and protection for its most visible stars. Axios.com. And in retail, Saks Global emerged from Chapter 11 as exemplar luxury group. With lower debt, fewer stores, and a sharper focus on affluent shoppers. The company said its balance sheet includes a roughly 75% debt reduction and additional financing. APnews.com. That is the retail cycle in one sentence. Close weaker locations, reduce debt, narrow the brand promise, and hope the high-end customer remains resilient. So what are the forward-looking scenarios? First, on the Supreme Court, watch implementation, not just doctrine. The TPS ruling becomes real through notices, work authorization changes, employer decisions, and possible removal actions. The gun ruling becomes real through state legislative responses. The Monsanto ruling becomes real through lower courts dismissing or narrowing warning label claims. Second, on AI, watch access rules. If government-vetted release becomes the norm for frontier models, the AI industry's competitive structure could change. The winners may be large incumbents with compliance teams and government relationships. The losers may be smaller players who cannot easily get through the approval funnel. Third, on Apple and the AI supply chain, watch whether other hardware companies follow. If memory and storage costs keep rising, price hikes may spread. If consumers push back, margins, upgrade cycles, and revenue forecasts come under pressure. Fourth, on geopolitics and commodities, watch Hormuz. A single vessel strike can move risk premiums. A sustained disruption can move energy markets. Fifth, on climate and infrastructure, watch the West heading into July 4th. Fireworks restrictions are a headline, but the deeper story is drought, heat, wind, insurance stress, and local governments trying to prevent one spark from becoming a regional emergency. And finally, on sports, watch Day 2 of the NHL Draft and the next wave of trades. The first round showed that teams are not just drafting, they are repricing timelines. The closing takeaway is this: institutions are being asked to move faster than they were designed to move. Courts are settling questions that immediately affect families, companies, states, and regulators. AI systems are advancing faster than the old software release model can comfortably handle. Supply chains built for consumer electronics are being squeezed by data center demand. Cities and states are managing physical risk in real time. Sports franchises are treating future assets like tradable securities. The question beneath all of it is not whether stress exists. It does. The question is which institutions can adapt without breaking, and who pays the cost when they cannot. This has been your Top Stories Wrap-Up for June 27, 2026. As always, this is for informational purposes only. It is not financial, legal, medical, safety, or investment advice. For decisions involving money, law, health, emergency preparedness, or public safety, consult qualified professionals and official authorities.